Thank you for coming out tonight. I hope those of you who went to the big dinner don't fall asleep on me. The food was really good. I thought I would like to do a program that was fun, and I think tonight's program will be fun. It's an interesting topic, and I entitled it Searching for Jane Gale, whom I had never heard of until I got a telephone call in 1994 from a man by the name of Jim Trottier out of Biddeford, Maine, saying, "Hello, is this the historian?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Well, what can you tell me about Jane Gale?" And I said, "Nothing." Never heard of her. He said, "Well, you should have. She was a silent movie star." I said, "Oh, I didn't know that. And she's from Salem." So he put me on the track, and I researched Jane Gale for him. It took us a couple of years to finally get enough information for an article that he wanted to write about Jane Gale. He's a silent film buff. And he said, he said, we all know who the big stars are. We all know the Keatons and the Chaplins and the Gish girls and so on. He said, but in the early silent films, there were stars that nobody even talks about today. Early on, there was not a lot of publicity about these stars. At least, we didn't have television. We didn't have big movie theaters per se. He said, but they are as important as the big names. So I did a little research for him, and he ended up writing an article for Classic Images magazine, and it got published in the magazine in the September issue. He then asked, as I was visiting with him, if we had any of your films. I said, no, we have none here. So he said, I'm going to send you some films. He sent me 3 films. The first one we're going to see tonight is Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. That was Jane's earliest film. The other 2 he sent were Traffic and 20,000 Leagues Below the Sea, the first underwater film ever made. So Jane really had some firsts in her life and in filmdom as far as making films. Now originally, films had music, and there may be some people in this room who remember Bess Worm. Bess Worm was a musician. She played the piano. Our theater was on the corner, and then up where the brick building where the health center is right now. That was the Star Theater later on. Silent films, but Bess Worm was the person who supplied the background music. And the background music was scored. It would come with the movie. And so Bess would sit down at the piano, or whoever was there, piano or organ sometimes, and she would play the music as she saw it. You have to watch the screen because you had to sort of be in sync with the action on the screen. And that was early music for those films. The film that we're going to see tonight is the shortest of the 3 films because the others run about an hour, and that's a long time. It would extend our program beyond what I would want it to be. But we'll watch a silent film. It'll not have any accompaniment to it, no music, so you'll have to just create it in your minds. But of course, music used to help set the tone of the film. In my search for Jane Gale, I discovered that she was known as Ethel McGee. And when she went on the stage, she took the name Jane Gale. I don't know how she arrived at the name Jane Gale. I got a copy of her death certificate from Florida. And as I was reading it, it said, father's name, Gale, first name Gale. I said, maybe that's it. But I researched it and said, no, that's not right. Because he was really Charles B. McGee. There was no Gale involved. So whoever put that on her death certificate was in error. They just didn't know. And there perhaps is a reason for that, which I'll explain later. Now, Jane attended Salem Washington Academy. And according to the newspaper reports that I found about her, she loved to be on stage. She loved to be the center of attraction. She would appear in speaking competitions. She would give recitations at graduation ceremonies when she was a sophomore and a junior. and obviously when she graduated. And by the way, there were only 2 graduates in her class, and a boy and Jane in the class, or Ethel, as she was known here. Now, Ethel was the daughter of Charles and Elizabeth McGee, and they lived on West Broadway, and the house is still there. The house is owned by one of the Sullivan sons. It's the last house on the right before you cross the little bridge at Beaver Brook. And that house was handed down over the years through the McGee family. And some of you may remember Fremont McGee and Nancy McGee, who were the last McGees to live in the house. I believe that Charles and his family, which was Elizabeth and Ethel and Frank, she had a brother, Frank, lived on North Main Street where the new bank is now. They just rented an apartment. And they didn't remain very long in Salem after Ethel graduated from school. When Ethel graduated, she went west. She went to Chicago and joined up with the Frohman Theatrical Company and went on stage. Now, I knew that much, but what I didn't know was how prolific her stage work was. And I found that out by writing any number of places, like the Library of Congress, to see what they had on their records, and checking newspapers. At any rate, between leaving high school and doing her first film, she was at the Frohman Dramatic School in Chicago, and she had a 12-year stage career with Schubert's and other stage production companies, including stints on vaudeville. Vaudeville was very big. We had vaudeville here in Salem. We had all kinds of shows here in Salem in Proudfoot Hall, and also in this courthouse, up in the courtroom, which was built, as you know, if you go up there, on a slant. And it was done that way so that everyone would have a good point of view looking at the stage. Now, some of the roles, leading roles and supporting roles that she was in, just to give you an example, one was The City. These are examples that I found in the newspapers. The Rack and Pillars of Society. Now, it's interesting in reading the newspapers and the trade papers, because you can see how much traveling they did. Because when they told about the plays, they would say this was playing in Chicago. This was playing in Skaneateles. This was playing in Albany. So you got an idea that this troupe of players, just traveled the East all the time, going from one place to another, and living in boarding houses, because that's what they would have to do. They couldn't have a permanent home. So they would just go from place to place. It was a busy time, and there was life on the road. Now, in 1912, she discovered film, or perhaps film discovered her, because evidently somebody saw that she had good acting ability. And her first film was, as I mentioned, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. She also made a bunch of comedies called the Jane series. And her first motion picture that was considered to be a major film, it was a 6-reeler, because up to that time, films were 1 reel. So if you went to the movies, you might have seen a reel of this person, or that person, and that person, but they were 1-reelers. This was a 6-reel film, which lasted over an hour, which is a long time, because the thought at that time was that the public couldn't stand more than an hour of watching a movie. Little did they know, because now we sit there for 3.5 hours sometimes. But that was the predominant thought. Traffic in Souls, as I said, was a big film for her. She made it for a company called IMP, which is the Independent Moving Picture Company, which was a big company at the time. And there she met a good friend named Ethel Grandin, who co-starred, in a sense, with her in Traffic in Souls. Later, she was the lead actress all by herself in 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. And as I mentioned, the first film made underwater. The underwater scenes were shot in the Bahamas. The interior scenes were shot back at the studio, just as they do today. If they're not on site, you'll see it back in the studio. And if you watch Turner Classic Movies. A lot of those films were made on the studio lot, Universal lot, in many instances. So that's the way that particular film was meant. But it was an unprecedented film because it was the first time anybody attempted to shoot underwater in the ocean. Now, Ethel's career spanned only 8 years, from 1912 to 1920. And I know in our publicity we said she appeared in 79 films. As I was reviewing my material, I discovered that there were some films that were not on the original list that I had of 79 films. There were some other films which she did and was credited being in. So as it turns out now, she appeared in 83 films during that period of time. She played opposite really popular actors like King Baggett, whom we will see tonight, playing the part of Dr. Jekyll, and Mr. Hyde, William E. Shea, Matt Moore, Albert Chevalier, and Gerald Ames. And those names mean nothing to you because they're way before our times. But in this particular time period, they were popular actors, as Jane was a popular actress. Now, she made a ton of films, and I'll just read off some of the names of them. His Hour of Triumph. And you might note that a lot of these films were based on classical novels or stage plays, things that had been done on the stage, and then they were adapted for film. Not a lot of original scripts written at this time. That came later. His Hour of Triumph, Night and Morning, Who Killed Olga Carew, England Expects, that was 1914. And that was when the war broke out in England. The Middleman, The Prisoner of Zenda, Rupert of Hentzau, She Stoops to Conquer, Called Back, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, The Corsican Brothers, The Girl Who Didn't Think. That sounds sort of sexist, doesn't it? Ashamed of the Old Folk, and her last film, Bitter Fruit. Now, the irony of Bitter Fruit is it was her last film in 1920, and I'll read some information that I received from Edward Brownlow. Bitter Fruit got terrible reviews at that time. But no matter about this last film that she did, it was evident after reading all the films and the reviews of the other films that she did, she was really an important star at that time. Now in 1913, she worked for IMP for about a year. In 1913, George Tucker, who was actually working as a director for IMP, got into some sort of a disagreement, and he decided to go to England. And he went to England and he organized a film company called the London Films. But within 2 years, the London Films went out of business. World War I broke out, and they had to close down. Jane returned. She made films while she was there, but she returned to this country to act in and for the Universal Film Company, which was a merger of the former IMP company, and there were 5 other independent film companies that joined Universal, so they created a huge company. Now, in 1920, the year she did her last film, at age 39, she got married. She married a famous CBS News broadcaster named Edwin C. Hill, who lived in Manhattan at that time. An interesting thing, the United States Census of 1930 had Jane listing her age as 35 to Edwin's age of 48. The 35 was an error, obviously, because she was born in 1881, making her 49. Typical actress's ploy? I don't know. At any rate, we don't know if that was the census taker's error or Jane's intent of trying to stay young. Now, by 1914, filming on the East Coast, and I don't know whether you know this or not, but the filming industry began on the East Coast before it went west. And there was a lot of filming in New York City, in New Jersey, and in Ithaca, the hometown of my wife, hiding back there in the corner, which was interesting to us because we could actually go to some of these spots where these films were made. Now, Universal Pictures then purchased 230 acres in California, which today is known as Hollywood. And so they moved everybody there, including Jane and her company, because first of all, the sun shined in California. It seldom shined in Ithaca. They discovered it was warm, and they could shoot a lot of things right on the lot. It was a more financially efficient way to make a movie, unless they went to on-site, which they still did. Now, if you watch the Turner's Channel for the classical films at all, you might have seen a movie called The Perils of Pauline. Anybody here seen that? Okay. The Perils of Pauline starred Pearl White, and these films, many of them were made in the city of Ithaca. Buttermilk Falls in Ithaca, beautiful falls. And I remember the film distinctly with Pauline trying to climb up the falls and trying to get saved. And it was interesting to be able to go see those places. Another popular silent movie at that time was one called Beatrix Fairfax. Anybody ever hear of Beatrix Fairfax? She was sort of an amateur detective who wrote a love column for the newspaper. And people would write her just as they do today, saying, I got this problem. But Beatrice would go beyond that. She just wouldn't answer them and let it go at that. She would take their problems personally and act as a detective to try to help them by going out to solve the mystery or the problem. And those films were shot in the city of Ithaca. And as we watched that, as my wife and I watched them, we could say, oh, they're on State Street. Oh, they're at the Home Dairy now. And we knew where these places were, so it was wonderful to be able to see them. And my wife also reminded me that just up the street from her, in a fancy house, lived Irene and Vernon Castle, who were terrific. But that's why they were in Ithaca, because they were there. That's where they lived when they were making movies. And then, of course, there was my wife's house, which was on Triphammer Road. Now, because Jane had spent some time in London, I thought I would somehow try to get some information out of London. And in watching the Turner Classic Movie Channel, we had just watched the Charlie Chaplin series, and a name kept appearing at the bottom, the name of Kevin Brownlow. And it turns out Kevin Brownlow is probably the best read and most knowledgeable person dealing with silent films in the world. So I wrote Kevin Brownlow and said, I'm looking for information about Jane Gale. What can you tell me about her? And he wrote back. And I'm going to read the letter that he wrote back because it was really an important letter. He said, I have always wondered what happened to her. It's intriguing to know that her real name was McGee, which places her origins at once in Northern Ireland, like the famous actor Patrick McGee. And he goes on to talk about Traffic in Souls. He says, Traffic in Souls was presented with a small orchestra at the Pordenone Silent Film Festival in Italy a couple of years ago. It was a great success. He says, the video was a pale shadow of the original film, but it should show you the fascinating location work as well as the fact that Jane Gale was an excellent actress, presenting more of a believable character than Ethel Grandin in the same film. Remember, Ethel was a good friend of hers, so little competition there. And he goes on to say, the Jane series appears to have been produced for Universal in California, a series of one-reel comedies. Some of these may survive, but one- and two-reelers were churned out at such a rate in the early days that most have been lost or destroyed. Kevin Brownlow had this to say about her last film, Bitter Fruit. When the careers of silent players were on the wane, they began to appear in Poverty Road productions, program pictures made very quickly and very cheaply. These were invariably terrible and put the seal of doom on their work. Bitter Fruit appears to be such a film. The other players are unknown, but they are known because I was able to track them down, but he didn't know them at that time. Mr. Brownlow also said that one film of Jane Gale existed in his collection, In Peril of the Sea, which was made in 1913 in London and shown in the United States under the title of The Boatswain's Mate. Another source, an early source, the Moving Picture World magazine of December 30th of 1913 said this about Jane on her departure for England to work for London Films. Her departure will be regretted by a host of friends who know her by her work on the screen and also by the many who have been so fortunate as to make her personal acquaintance. Miss Gale has been with IMP a year and has done much important work. Miss Gale is easy in drama, in comedy, or in comedy drama. It is in the latter department that her versatility shows to best advantage. Strong mentality is marked in every line of her face. And I did put on certain chairs a photograph of Jane. I think the first one in the left corner is when she was a young actress, and the one on the right side is when she's a little older. And he goes on to say, or this person goes on to say, but she is bothered with none of the fancies, inconsistencies, and follies that beset the average star. And get this, and she does not nurse a dog or a bird. She is simple in taste, plain in works, and direct in action. Her work appeals to her, and she goes into it with a joyous heart and receptive mind. Miss Gale is Scotch-Irish. This fact may in measure account for her strength in serious work and the sparkling quality of her comedy interpretations. Now, I found a copy of Jane's death certificate from St. Petersburg. She and Edwin Hill, after he retired from CBS, moved to Florida, moved to St. Petersburg, Florida. Edwin died shortly after that in 1957 in St. Anthony's Hospital. And Jane died in the same hospital in 1963. A radio associate of Edwin Hill, Sheila Stewart Wasey, who worked for the Clearwater radio station, WDCL's talk show called Coffee Break with Sheila and B, was named on Jane's death certificate. I think Sheila Wasey is the person that gave the information to put on the certificate, and that's why some of the details there were incorrect. She just did not know Jane's, the father, first name of Jane's father. Now, the assumption is that Jane and Sheila were living together, or that Sheila was living close by at the time of her death. Her obituary mentions Sheila's relationship to Edward. This is an interesting detail, but not to Jane, leaving a mystery. And according to researcher Virginia Michaels, who told me this, about the real relationship between the threesome. Hollywood hasn't changed. Could Sheila have written the obituary? Most likely. There was nobody else. They had no children. There was nobody else to write an obituary, so I think that's a foregone conclusion. Jane and Edwin were not buried in Florida. Jane and Edward were buried in the Ferncliff Cemetery in Hartsdale, Westchester County. Remember, they lived in Manhattan for a number of years. I tried to find out information about Jane's life with Edwin and really came to a roadblock. I could not find, what did she do with her time? Here's a person who was in the spotlight, who was very sociable, loved to be on the stage. I can't imagine her sitting around the Manhattan apartment doing nothing. But I couldn't find anything about those sorts of activities. I wrote Sheila Wasey in an attempt to find out, and she never responded. So, and the reason she never responded might have been that Sheila had passed away also. But nobody knew it. The letter didn't come back, nothing. I also wrote St. Petersburg, hoping that the newspapers or a museum or an historical society might know something about Jane's everyday life afterward. But again, I got nothing back from them. Now, since Edwin Hill was an important part of her life, I thought I would do some research on him. Edwin Hill was famous in his own right. And here's an interesting thing. Hill was not his last name. Hill was his mother's maiden name. His father's name was Boone. But again, for stage purposes, if you want to call it that, he decided to use his mother's maiden name. He was born in Aurora, Indiana in 1884, went to the University of Indiana, worked for the New York Sun for 22 years. How did he meet Jane? I don't know, can only guess. I found this interesting article in the Sun in 1916 when he wrote a long article about the United States troop mobilization along the Mexican border in search for General Pancho Villa. And he spoke about camp life, the soldiers, and the entertainment. And he mentioned the wonderful entertainment they had with movies. And he mentions the actresses, Mary Pickford, the Gish stars, Mademoiselle Petrova, and Jane Gale. If nothing else, he obviously knew Jane from her motion picture work. And he might have even met her during or through his newspaper work. Jane, as I said, was very social. And I have articles describing the parties she went to, the dances she went to, the other social events she went to during this period of time. And you have a reporter who probably got around also. So we might have met her during one of those activities. In 1936, Edwin Hill won the Best Commentator Award over Bate Carter and H.V. Kaltenborn. Before television, we listened to radio. The radio was on in my house, it seems like 24 hours a day. We woke up to the news. We went to school. When I was in elementary school, I came home for lunch. The news was on the radio. I went back to school, came home for dinner. The news was on the radio. And in the evening, we would sit around the radio listening to those wonderful 15-minute and a half-hour shows on the radio. And during the day, my mother listened to soap operas, all day long. Sit there ironing, washing, soap operas that were on radio at that time. He was a terrific news broadcaster, and in 1933, he left the Sun. William Randolph Hearst saw his work, and so William Randolph Hearst hired him in 1933 to write a daily editorial called The Human Side of the News. In addition to newspaper writing, he directed the Fox Movietone newsreel. You young people in the audience don't know about theater newsreels, but those of us who are a little older, the newsreel would always precede the film. And if it wasn't the Fox News, it was Movietone News, it was somebody else's news, but we'd get 10 to 15 minutes of film news. Hill directed his own films too. One was The Fighting President, 1933, and Hitler's Reign of Terror in 1934, as well as announcing for other films made by other people. Now, a few years ago, a French movie entitled The Artist. Did anybody see that? The Artist. Okay, a few people have. Attempted to recreate the age of silent films. While saying a silent film was interesting, film critic David Denby in the February 27th The New Yorker magazine noted that the film lacked the intensity of early silent films. Denby went on to say, "Silent film is another country. They speak another language there, a language of gestures, stares, flapping mouths, halting or skittering walks, and sometimes movements and expressions of infinite intricacy and beauty." He also went on to say, "The men and women who became romantic stars were young with perfect skin that could withstand the high-powered illumination. They had saucer eyes." And if you look at those pictures of Ethel, you'll notice that Ethel has big eyes. They had saucer eyes with very white whites and perfect teeth, not easy to come by 90 years ago. The leading men had aquiline noses, the women bowed lips. Silent films, he continued, drew on the heroic and melodramatic traditions of 19th and early 20th century theater. It drew as well on mime, magic shows, and vaudeville. And Jane Gale had all those attributes. So there you have it, a brief history of Jane Gale. And the film that's always attributed as being the first talkie is The Jazz Singer. Actually, soundtracks had been invented before then. The Jazz Singer, I think, happened to be the first talkie in which all the actors talked. I watched a film the other night on TCM, which had background music, but it also had crowd noises. But it was still a silent film in that you had to read the dialogue. You did not hear the actors talk, just written dialogue on the screen. So they and we're quite sure what to do with this new thing. You know, what do we do with it? The other problem was, and it might have been Jane's problem, but I don't think so, because she was big on the stage. The other problem was, and if you ever watched Singing in the Rain, would you watch that musical? Anybody? You'll know there that they depict the fact that this beautiful looking actress, when they tried to use her voice, she talked like this. And of course, that ended her career. And that happened to a lot of actors and actresses. They just didn't have the voices to go along with talking on screen. Silent film itself, when it comes up on the screen, will say, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, King Bagot. It doesn't mention Jane at all. Usually at the end of the film, they would have the cast. This film is really old. It's not of the greatest quality, and I think that part is probably gone. So we never do see the rest of the cast in the film. But if you look it up on the Internet Movie Database, IMDb, and you look up the film, they have the cast, so you can see who the rest of the people were. But Jane Gale in the film, you will see right off the top when it comes up.
I feel a lot better. That proves she's from Salem.
Just a few concluding remarks. I want to thank all of you for coming out tonight. As I mentioned earlier, that when I was a kid growing up, we just sat by the radio and listened to our favorite programs. One of my favorite programs was Mr. Keen, Tracer of Lost Persons. Somebody else knows that. And, and for those of you who don't, Mr. Keen was sort of like a detective again, and somebody would come to him and say, I'm looking for so-and-so, and he would go off and find this person. And I never thought I'd become a Mr. Keen of my day in trying to do this. Okay, well, thank you for coming.